Hi, my name is Lori, and so my paper is going to be looking at the gendered nature of madness and disability in Hamlet. This is the first place where my research kind of took a shift. I was originally okay. So in my research, I found this idea of mad studies. Was actually started in Canada and kind of looks at the way that the term mad and madness can kind of be reclaimed as a resistance to over medicating and the stigmatization of mental illness and mental instability. And so the definition that I found for MAD studies, which is a subsection of disability studies, which is the continuation of the Anti-Psychiatry Project of Activist Organizing and Dissent, a venture in the politics of mad identity and survivor nationhood, and an exercise directed toward all those whose lives collide with the power of psychiatry. And so, very much in the same way that disability studies kind of emerged out of this need for a political identity, so that the ADA could be passed and that people with disabilities could fight for their rights. MAD Studies is emerging, ongoing in Canada, to kind of attempt to do the same thing for people with mental and emotional illnesses and instability. And so what I'm hoping to do with this paper is to kind of contextualize, using Hamlet, the way that madness, as represented in literature, connects with emotional instability and mental illness within the broader umbrella of disability studies. Now, I do have to say, especially because disability studies is still such a modern and ongoing field of study, it's important to acknowledge, and it's important for me to keep in mind while I'm doing my research, that disability studies and Shakespeare is kind of a contentious issue. I don't want to impose modern sensibilities on Elizabethan culture. And so the avenue that I'm kind of taking with this to avoid anachronism, essentially, is that I am just kind of observing. So the things that I am trying to find and the things that I'll discuss on the next slide in my thesis statement um, are just kind of observations. And I'm not saying that Shakespeare necessarily knew that he was doing this. I'm not saying that Shakespeare even meant to do this. He very well could have, because he was very educated and knew what he was doing. But this is just, again, an interpretation and a lens to kind of analyze and compare and contrast the gendered nature of mental illness within Hamlet specifically. So the thesis for my paper is that in Hamlet, Shakespeare's representation of mental illness and mental disability, more commonly referred to as madness, and for the purposes of this paper, it reinforces or perhaps creates the cliche of female hysteria while stigmatizing mental illness in men as an inherently emasculating condition. I'm very interested in looking at the origins of this idea of female hysteria, and as we were reading a lot of these works over the past weeks, and comparing and contrasting Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, King Lear and his daughters, it was very interesting, very obvious that the way that Shakespeare interpreted mental illness in men was very different than the way that he interpreted mental illness in women. And so I'm looking at the way that Shakespeare uses emotional instability in the case of Hamlet, grief, loss, as something that leads to psychosis, and using this as a degenerative character arc. So basically, when you are mentally unstable, it is kind of like the fall from grace. And that this actually reinforces the idea of able-bodiedness, while simultaneously removing the autonomy of characters with mental and emotional instability through their deaths at the end of the story. I'm specifically interested in looking at the way that male characters are kind of blamed for their own madness. I mean, we've all kind of looked at this conversation of, is Hamlet actually mad? Is he faking it? And kind of looking at the way that secondary characters don't really do much. They see him, kind of losing it, but they just kind of let him deal with it and go along with it. Whereas with Ophelia, there's a very active response when people started seeing that she was struggling. They immediately were like, we have to do something about this. Obviously, it didn't really work. But it was just that people felt like they needed to be more involved in Ophelia's madness than they needed to be in Hamlet's madness. And so again, this is where my research definitely took a shift. Because I was considering looking at Ophelia's death as an act of resistance, which was something that I heard at a conference in February. It was the first time I'd ever heard it. They were actually comparing her death with Padme's death in Star Wars. And so I think that argument's really interesting. I think that looking at Ophelia's death as an act of taking back control is really, really fascinating. And it raises a lot of questions about discussions of assisted suicide and what these interpretations kind of mean for the future of disability studies. But this isn't something that I really have time to look at in my paper right now. Okay, so then just for a quick look at my literature review, essentially what it turned into was an exploration of interpretations of Ophelia's madness. There were quite a few articles that kind of discussed the way directors approached Ophelia, and the way that directors approached Ophelia's suicide, which is not so much what my paper is about, but it was interesting nonetheless, and is an interesting commentary on the way that interpretation changes over time. As some articles, specifically Carolyn Bialo's article and the Borden article, talked about this a good bit, that there were some directors who emphasized, quote-unquote, make her crazy, and then there were some who were like, explore it, have fun with it, look at it more like psychosis, and so that was kind of interesting, and that's another topic entirely to kind of think about the way that portrayals of these characters are different. But it is really good for a discussion of, the way that the character reads, and that, a first kind of response to her madness, Ophelia's madness, is that it is different than Hamlet's. And so that was kind of the rest of the articles. The mechanics of madness in Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear was extremely helpful. I thought intertextual madness in Hamlet was kind of fascinating. It talked a lot about essentially like ghost stories and witchcraft and demonology during the Elizabethan period, which is something that I think a lot of us do find really fascinating. It basically kind of gives a cohesive conclusion that ensures that the role of the ghost is not simplistic in Hamlet, and that there's actually a whole lot more to him than we would expect. Mourning and Misogyny is going to be very influential in my final paper because it raises questions about madness and melancholia, and kind of reinforces the idea that Hamlet's madness is part of his inability to grieve within the confines of a social structure that is very misogynistic, very patriarchal, and expects him to react a certain way, and then he doesn't. The article goes on to contrast Hamlet's madness with Gertrude and the representation of her aging body in context with her grief, as well as Ophelia's madness, just briefly. Carol Neely's article, Elaine Showalter's article, and Barbara Smith's articles were all extremely interesting in terms of reinterpreting Hamlet as representative of the gendered narrative, because we do have Hamlet as the main character. However, Ophelia and Gertrude are also very, very important, and they do respond to grief in a different way than Hamlet, which is equally interesting. Okay, and then just lastly, really quickly, I am taking an interdisciplinary approach to this topic so that I can kind of look at disability and gender identity while looking at stigmatized gender norms in Elizabethan society as well as in the modern era. By looking at this interpretation of the connection between madness and gender, this way we can kind of start to understand the evolution of the representation of mental illness in literature, as influential for the interpretation of mental illness in modern times. And so my goal is ultimately to reinterpret madness through the lens of disability studies in hopes of normalizing discussions of mental illness both in literature and in society, so that we can further address accommodation needs and support systems. So that is it. I'm going to include a second bibliography of more works that I'm potentially going to be looking at in my paper, and thank you for listening.